The town saw Silas Thorne as a drifter, a convict, a man with a past not worth forgiving. But Eleanor Vance saw something different. She saw the man who fixed her fence, calmed her frightened horse, worked until his hands bled, and never once asked to be praised. In a land where judgment traveled faster than mercy, one woman dared to stand between a broken man and the world that wanted to bury him. This is not just a Western story. It is a story about redemption, courage, and the right to begin again.
The smoke hadn't cleared. It hung low over the Texas dirt, thick and biting. Eleanor Vance stood on the porch. Her hands were shoved deep into the pockets of her faded apron. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury a 40-year-old widow couldn't afford. Not out here, not in 1878. Before her lay the bones of her barn, blackened wood, sputtering embers, the smell of charred hay and lost hope. Her husband Thomas had been a good man, but a good man with bad debts is still a man who leaves you drowning. He'd been in the ground for 3 years. His debts, however, were very much alive. They breathed down her neck every first of the month. She stepped off the porch. Her boots crunched on the ash. The sound was loud in the dawn quiet. 3 horses lost. The heavy iron plow warped by the heat. The spring planting was just 2 weeks away. Without the plow, without the stock, the earth would sit hard and useless. She walked the perimeter of the ashes. The heat still radiated off the coals, stinging her cheeks. Her palms throbbed. Blisters had formed where she had gripped a burning halter, trying to pull a terrified mare from the flames. The pain was sharp, constant. It was a reminder that she was still breathing. For 3 years, she had fought the dry earth and the bankers. She had kept the Vance Ranch afloat, barely. The town of Red Rock had watched her, waiting for her to break, waiting for the widow to pack her bags and head back east. They didn't know her. The sound of hooves broke the morning silence. A matched pair of grays, a polished buggy rolling up the dirt drive. Arthur Sterling, 55 years old, banker, landowner, a man who wore silk vests in cattle country. He didn't come to help, he came to collect, or more accurately, to acquire. Sterling pulled back on the reins. He didn't step down into the soot. He just looked at the ruins, then at Eleanor. He offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A tragedy, Eleanor. A profound tragedy. She didn't blink. It's a fire, Arthur. Tragedies are for the theater. He chuckled. A dry, rattling sound like snakes in the brush. You're a stubborn woman. But even iron bends when it gets hot enough. You can't rebuild this. You don't have the stock. You don't have the men. Sell the ranch to me. I'll clear Thomas's debts. I'll make sure you live comfortably in town. You shouldn't be out here doing a man's work anyway. Eleanor squared her shoulders. This was where the line had to be drawn, explicitly. Arthur, she said, her voice steady, ringing out over the smoking wood. You think money buys everything. You think it buys land, and you think it buys people. But let me make this absolutely clear to you right now. A woman's dignity is not a commodity to be traded at your bank. My rights to this land and my right to stand as an equal in this county do not vanish just because my barn burned down. I have the exact same right to work this soil as any man. I will not sell my independence for your version of comfort. Sterling's smile vanished. His jaw tightened. The benevolent mask slipped just for a second. Pride doesn't pay the bank, Eleanor. Equality is a pretty word, but it doesn't plant wheat. We'll see how loud you preach when the bank calls the note in full. He tipped his hat. He whipped the reins. The buggy turned around and drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled like snow over the black ashes. She slept in a wooden chair that night, a shotgun across her lap. When dawn broke, the sky was the color of a bruised peach, cold, quiet. Eleanor opened the front door to check the yard. She stepped out into the chill. She stopped. There, right on the edge of the wooden porch, sat a willow basket. It wasn't big, woven tight, neatly made. It sat perfectly in the center of the top step. She knelt, keeping the shotgun in one hand. Inside the basket, wrapped in a clean checkered cloth, was a loaf of cornbread, still warm. Beside it, a bunch of fresh, vibrant carrots. and a small torn piece of brown paper. 3 words written in a rough hand. Sharing your loss. Eleanor stood up. She scanned the horizon. The rolling plains were empty, nothing but sagebrush and long morning shadows stretching across the dirt. Who? Her mind immediately went to the church auxiliary. The women in town meant well, but they usually delivered their pity in person so they could see her gratitude. Then a darker thought crept in. Arthur Sterling. Was this his new game? Playing the benevolent savior, breaking her down with charity after threats failed, trying to make her feel soft and cared for so she would surrender her land? She picked up the basket. The bread smelled like heaven, but it felt like a trap. She brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and left it there. She wouldn't eat a single bite of Sterling's charity. By mid-afternoon, the Texas sun was a hammer beating down on the high plains. Eleanor walked the northern boundary line. The fire had jumped the dry grass and taken out a quarter-mile of fencing. Without that fence, the wild mustangs would trample her wheat fields. What was left of them, anyway. She carried a heavy iron hammer and a canvas bucket of nails. Her hands were already raw. Every step sent a jolt of ache up her legs. She crested a small ridge and stopped. Someone was there. A man. He had his back to her, broad shoulders beneath a sun-faded blue shirt, dark hair graying at the temples. He was lifting a heavy cedar post, dropping it into a freshly dug hole. He moved with a quiet rhythm. Heft, drop, tamp the dirt. He wasn't one of her old hands. Josiah and Ezekiel were in town fetching supplies. Eleanor gripped her hammer tighter. She closed the distance, her boots heavy on the hard pan. "That's my fence," she called out. The man didn't jump, he didn't drop the post. He just finished tamping the dirt around the base. Then he turned slowly. 45, maybe older. A face weathered like old saddle leather. A jagged scar ran along his jawline, fading into a thick shadow of stubble. His eyes were the color of slate. Calm, unreadable. He didn't look dangerous, but he didn't look soft either. "Was broken," he said. His voice was gravel, low and rough like boots on a wooden floor. "I didn't hire you. Didn't ask you to." He turned away. He reached for another heavy post. Eleanor stepped closer. "Put it down. Who are you? Did Sterling send you?" The man paused. He leaned the post against his leg. He wiped his brow with the back of a scarred hand. He didn't look angry at the question, just tired. "Name's Silas. Silas Thorne. Don't know any Sterling." "Then what are you doing on my land, digging my holes?" "I'm a drifter, ma'am. Came down from the high country, looking for day labor. Saw a fence down. Figured a broken fence needs fixing before the cattle get through." He looked at her burned hands. He saw the red, angry skin. Then he looked at her face. He didn't offer pity. He didn't offer an apology for the fire. It was just a quiet acknowledgement of reality. Eleanor studied him. He looked like a man who had been chewed up by the world and spat out, the kind of man townsfolk lock their doors against. But he was working, hard, and he hadn't asked for a dime yet. She thought of the 2 older hands she had. Good men, loyal, but slow. She thought of the spring planting. She thought of the mountain of black ashes sitting by her house. "I need a hand," she said suddenly. Silas looked at her. He didn't smile. "I'm a drifter. Most folks don't hire my kind. Say we bring trouble. Say we ain't worth a full wage." Eleanor shook her head. She dropped her bucket of nails. She stepped right up to him, ignoring the height difference. She looked him dead in the eye. "Listen to me, Silas Thorne. I am going to tell you exactly how things work on the Vance Ranch. I do not care where you come from. I do not care what town you call home, or if you don't have one at all." She pointed a finger at his chest. Her voice was sharp, carrying across the open plains. "Every human being has a fundamental right to earn an honest living. Out here, a person's worth is measured by the sweat on their brow and the calluses on their hands, not by their social standing or their past. True equality means I will pay you a fair wage for a fair day's work. I will treat you with the exact same dignity as any man who has lived in this county his whole life. You do the work, you get the respect. That is the rule. I don't underpay drifters and I don't overpay fools. Do you understand me? Silas stared at her. For a long second, the wind just howled through the dry grass between them. The sun beat down on his shoulders. He had never heard a woman talk like that. He hadn't heard anyone talk like that. Not in a very long time. Men usually just saw his scars and his faded clothes and offered him half pay. He slowly reached up. He touched the brim of his dusty hat. I understand you, ma'am. Good. My name is Eleanor. It's 20 cents a day and a hot meal. You sleep in the line shack by the creek. Yes, ma'am. He turned back to the fence. He picked up his post-hole digger. Eleanor stood there a moment longer. She watched the rhythm of his shoulders, the steady, reliable movement. It was the first time since the fire started that her chest didn't feel so incredibly tight. She picked up her nails. She turned and walked back toward the house. She didn't know Silas Thorne had been awake since 3 in the morning. She didn't know his fingers were stained pale green from weaving willow branches in the dark. And she certainly didn't know that the rough, scarred man driving wooden posts into her soil was the exact same man who had left a warm loaf of bread on her porch at dawn. The sun came up like a slow fire over the eastern ridge. Eleanor stood in the doorway. The coffee in her tin cup was black and bitter, just the way she needed it. She looked down at her boots. Then she looked at the top step of the porch. Another basket. It sat in the exact same spot, dead center, woven willow, tight and clean. She stepped out into the morning chill. She picked it up. It felt heavy. Inside, tucked beneath a checkered cloth, was a glass bottle of fresh milk. The cream had settled thick at the top. Beside the bottle lay a small, tied bunch of bluebonnets. Their petals were still wet with morning dew. Eleanor stared at the flowers. Her jaw tightened. Arthur Sterling? She muttered to the empty yard. It made sense. It made ugly, twisted sense. Sterling was a man who played chess with people's lives. He had tried threats. He had tried foreclosure. Now he was trying romance. Or his version of it. A wealthy man sending his hired boys out in the dark to leave trinkets for the desperate widow, trying to soften her up, trying to make her feel like she needed a man to provide for her. She took the basket inside. She didn't throw it away. Food was food. The milk would go into the dough. But she took the bluebonnets and left them on the kitchen table, a stark reminder of the banker's manipulative game. By noon, the Texas heat was a physical weight. Out in the north field, the work was brutal. The fire had taken the plow, so the earth had to be broken the hard way. Pickaxe and shovel. Eleanor walked out to check the progress. Josiah and Ezekiel, her 2 older hands, were resting by the water barrel. They were good men, loyal to her late husband, but their backs were bent with age, and the heat took a heavy toll. Out in the dirt, Silas Thorne didn't stop. He swung the pickaxe. High arc, heavy drop. The iron bit into the baked clay. A sharp crack. He pulled it loose, stepped forward, swung again. He didn't wear a hat. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat. His blue shirt clung to his broad back. He moved with a relentless mechanical rhythm. No wasted energy. No complaints. Eleanor watched him for a long time. He was a ghost of a man. He didn't speak during breakfast. He ate fast, keeping his eyes on his plate. When Josiah asked him a question, Silas answered in single syllables. He existed purely in the motion of the work. "He's a workhorse, ma'am," Josiah said, wiping his brow with a dirty rag. "Ain't said 3 words to us all morning. Just took the heaviest pick and started swinging. Boy works like he's trying to outrun the devil." Eleanor nodded. She walked out into the broken dirt. Silas. The pickaxe stopped in midair. Silas lowered it. He turned to face her. His chest heaved, but his gray eyes were perfectly calm. "Ma'am. Take a break. There's water in the barrel. You're going to drop dead of heat stroke on my land, and I don't have the time to dig a grave." Silas wiped his face with his sleeve. "I'm fine." "That wasn't a question, Silas. It was an order from your boss. Drink." He looked at her for a second. Then he nodded. He walked over to the barrel, took the tin dipper, and drank deep. He didn't sit down. He just leaned against the fence post, looking out over the plains. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and reds, the workday ended. Eleanor sat on the front porch. She had an open ledger on her lap. The numbers were grim, but she forced herself to look at them, to know exactly where she stood. Footsteps crunched on the gravel. Silas walked up to the edge of the porch. He held his battered hat in his hands. He was clean. He had washed up at the creek. The smell of lye soap and cold water hung around him. "End of the week, ma'am," Silas said. His voice was rough. Eleanor closed the ledger. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. She counted out the coins. $1.20, 6 days of work. She held the money out to him. Silas looked at the coins. He didn't take them. He frowned, a slight furrow in his scarred brow. "That's full hand's pay." "Yes," Eleanor said. 20 cents a day, like we agreed." Silas shook his head. He took a half-step back. "I'm a drifter, Eleanor. I don't have a permanent address. I don't have references. Most folks pay a drifter half rate. 10 cents a day is fair for a man passing through. You need the money for the bank. Keep the rest." Eleanor's hand stayed suspended in the air. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't put the money away. Instead, she stood up. She walked to the very edge of the porch, looking down at him. "Silas Thorne, look at me." He raised his eyes. They met hers. "I want you to listen to me very carefully," Eleanor said, her voice ringing out in the quiet twilight. She spoke slowly, making sure every single word landed. "On this ranch, Silas, I don't pay based on your background. I do not care if you have a local address or if you sleep under the stars. I do not care if society calls you a drifter, a vagrant, or a king. I pay for the value of your labor. Respect for human dignity begins with fair compensation for the sweat you pour into this earth." Silas stood perfectly still. The wind rustled the dry grass behind him. Eleanor took a step down. She was closer to him now. "Don't devalue yourself. True equality starts with you acknowledging your own worth. You swung that pickaxe harder and longer than any man on this property. You gave me your time, your strength, and your honest labor. To pay you less simply because you don't have a house in town would be an insult to your humanity. And I do not insult the people who helped me survive." She reached out, took his rough, calloused hand, and pressed the coins firmly into his palm. "You take this money. You earned it. And you remember that on the Vance Ranch, a man's past does not dictate the price of his present dignity. Are we clear?" Silas looked down at the silver coins in his scarred hand. He had been beaten. He had been starved. He had been thrown in a cell for crimes he didn't commit. He had been told by the world that he was worth nothing. And now this woman, this fierce, desperate widow, was standing on her porch, demanding he recognize his own humanity. He closed his fist around the coins. The metal was warm from her hand. He looked back up at her. Something shifted in his slate-gray eyes, a quiet, profound locking into place. "We're clear, Eleanor." "Good. Breakfast is at 5. Don't be late." She turned and walked back inside, letting the screen door slap shut behind her. Silas stood in the yard for a long time. The night fell around him. He looked at the house, he looked at the porch. Then he walked back to the line shack, his mind already calculating where he could find the best wild sage to put in tomorrow's basket. A week passed. The rhythm of the ranch settled into a steady, hard beat. Every morning at dawn, there was a basket. Sometimes it was a few wild plums, sometimes a jar of honey, sometimes just a beautifully carved wooden spoon, the grains sanded smooth as glass. Eleanor took them all in. She placed the items on her kitchen counter. She hated Arthur Sterling, but the baskets were a strange comfort. They meant she wasn't entirely forgotten. They meant someone was paying attention, even if it was a manipulative banker. She convinced herself that as long as she didn't sell the land, she could take the food. It was reparations for the stress he caused her. Out in the yard, Silas was fixing what the fire broke. He didn't just swing a pickaxe. He had a quiet genius with his hands. He restitched the burned leather harnesses. He straightened the warped iron of the plow using a makeshift forge he built from field stones. He also had a way with the animals. Eleanor's last remaining young horse, a roan gelding named Copper, was terrified of the smell of smoke. The fire had spooked him deep. Whenever Josiah tried to saddle him, Copper would rear, eyes rolling white, hooves kicking at the air. On a Tuesday afternoon, Eleanor stood by the corral, watching Josiah fail again. "He's ruined, ma'am," Josiah panted, backing away from the kicking horse. "Fire got into his head. He won't take a bit. We might have to sell him for scrap." Silas walked up to the fence. He didn't say a word to Josiah. He just unlatched the gate and stepped into the dirt ring. "Silas, watch out, he's crazy," Josiah warned. Silas didn't stop. He walked slowly. He didn't raise his hands. He kept his shoulders low. Copper snorted, backing into the far corner, muscles trembling. Silas stopped about 10 feet away. He stood perfectly still. He let out a low, rhythmic breath. Then he started to hum, a deep, vibrating sound in his chest, a lullaby without words. He took one step. Copper twitched, but didn't run. Silas took another step. He reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a small, dried apple. He held it flat on his palm. He didn't extend his arm. He just waited. 5 minutes passed. The Texas wind blew dust across the corral. Slowly, Copper lowered his head. He took a tentative step forward, then another. He reached out, his velvet nose sniffing Silas's hand. The horse took the apple. While Copper chewed, Silas slowly raised his other hand and rested it gently on the horse's neck. He ran his fingers through the tangled mane. He leaned in and whispered something into the horse's ear. It was too low for Eleanor to hear. But Copper's ears flicked forward and the wild fear in his eyes melted away. Eleanor watched from the fence. Her heart did a strange, slow roll in her chest. How could a man with hands that scarred be that gentle? The moment was broken by the sound of rolling wheels. Eleanor turned. Arthur Sterling's buggy was pulling into the yard again. Sterling sat tall on the leather seat, wearing a dark suit that had no business being in the sun. He tied off his horses and stepped down, carrying a rolled-up document. "Afternoon, Eleanor," Sterling called out, flashing his polished smile. Eleanor's jaw set. She stepped away from the corral to meet him in front of the house. Silas stayed in the ring with Copper, but his eyes tracked the banker. "What do you want, Arthur? I told you I'm not selling." Sterling sighed, playing the part of the weary saint. "Eleanor, I'm not here to fight. I merely brought the updated ledger for your husband's debts. The interest is accruing. I want to make sure you have the exact figures. I am trying to be transparent with you. Put it on the porch." Sterling walked up the steps. He paused. He looked through the open screen door. Sitting on the kitchen table in clear view was the carved wooden spoon from yesterday's basket, resting next to a jar of wild honey. A sly, calculating look crossed Sterling's face. He turned back to Eleanor. His voice dropped an octave, trying to sound intimate. "I see you're enjoying the honey, Eleanor." Eleanor froze. "What?" Sterling gestured vaguely toward the door. "The small comforts, the gifts. I know the fire was hard on you. I just wanted to make sure you had something sweet to wake up to. I wanted to show you that my intentions toward you aren't strictly business. A woman like you deserves to be taken care of." Eleanor felt a wave of revulsion wash over her. So she was right. It was him. She crossed her arms tight across her chest. "Keep your honey, Arthur, and keep your baskets. You think leaving bread on my porch is going to make me forget you're trying to steal my home? You think a few trinkets buy my affection?" Sterling smiled warmly, completely unfazed. "It's not bribery, my dear, it's courtship. A man of means expressing his admiration for a strong woman. Take the gifts, Eleanor." Let them remind you that life doesn't have to be this hard. You just have to say yes to me." He tipped his hat, left the rolled document on a chair, and walked back to his buggy. He drove away, looking very pleased with himself. Eleanor stood on the porch, her blood boiling. She hated him. She hated his arrogance. But down by the corral, hidden in the shadow of the barn, Silas Thorne heard every single word. He stood holding the lead rope, perfectly still. The world seemed to slow down. "It's courtship," Sterling had said. Silas looked down at his own hands. They were calloused, scarred, dirty from the soil. The fingers that had spent 3 hours the night before carefully carving that wooden spoon were currently wrapped around a frayed piece of rope. He looked up at Eleanor. She was looking at the house, a mixture of anger and weariness on her face. Silas felt a hollow ache open up in his chest, an old familiar pain, the pain of the invisible man. He could walk up there right now. He could tell her the truth. He could tell her he wove the baskets. He could tell her he picked the bluebonnets by the creek in the moonlight. But why would he? He was Silas Thorne, an ex-convict, a drifter with nothing to his name but a bedroll and a broken past. What could he offer a woman like Eleanor Vance? More dirt? More hardship? Arthur Sterling had a bank. He had a buggy. He had respectability. Silas watched Eleanor rub her forehead, her shoulders slumping just a fraction when she thought no one was looking. The fire, the debts, the sheer exhaustion of it all was crushing her. If Arthur Sterling claiming the baskets made Eleanor feel, even for a brief second, that someone in town with power was looking out for her, if it made her feel safe, even falsely, who was Silas to take that away? He was just the hired help, a ghost in the machinery of her life. Silas tightened his grip on the rope. He turned his back to the house. He led Copper toward the water trough. He made his decision right then in the dust. He would let the banker take the credit. He would let the rich man wear the crown. But tonight, when the ranch was asleep, Silas would walk down to the creek. He would find the softest willow branches. He would weave another basket. He would bake another loaf of bread on the coals of his small fire. Because he wasn't doing it for credit. He wasn't doing it for courtship. He was doing it because she was Eleanor, and she deserved to find something good on her porch when the sun came up, even if she never knew his name was attached to it. The wind shifted on a Thursday. It blew in from the east, hot and carrying the smell of dry sage. And trouble. Silas was working near the house. He was resetting the stone foundation of the ruined barn. It was heavy, back-breaking work. He moved the large stones one by one. His hands were coated in white limestone dust. Eleanor was on the porch peeling potatoes into a tin bucket. The rhythm of her knife was steady. Then the sound of horses, multiple horses. Eleanor looked up. Silas stopped lifting. 5 men rode into the yard. They didn't come slow. They rode with the sharp, aggressive trot of men who felt they owned the ground they spit on. At the front was Sheriff Miller, a man whose badge was shinier than his conscience. Beside him were 3 local ranchers, and bringing up the rear, sitting straight in his tailored suit on a rented roan, was Arthur Sterling. Silas wiped his dusty hands on his trousers. He didn't run, he didn't hide. He just stood by the stones, his face a blank mask of stone itself. He knew what this was. He had seen this posse in 4 different towns over the last 5 years. The riders pulled up by the porch. Dust swirled around the horses' legs. "Afternoon, Eleanor," Sheriff Miller said, touching his hat brim. But his eyes weren't on her. They were pinned dead on Silas. "Sheriff," Eleanor said. She didn't stand up. She kept the peeling knife in her hand. "To what do I owe the crowd? You boys lost a calf?" Sterling spoke up, his voice dripping with false concern. "We came for your safety, Eleanor. We came to remove a threat from your property." Eleanor stopped peeling. She set the knife down on the edge of the bucket. She stood up. She wiped her hands on her apron. "There's no threat here, Arthur. Just my hired hand resetting a foundation." Sheriff Miller spurred his horse a few steps closer. He unhooked the leather strap holding his revolver in its holster. It was a small movement, but everyone saw it. "That man ain't just a hired hand, Mrs. Vance," the sheriff said. "I got a wire from Kansas this morning. Bank over in Red Rock ran a background check on the drifters in the county, courtesy of Mr. Sterling." Sterling smiled a thin, bloodless smile. "Just looking out for the community." "The wire says his name is Silas Thorne," the sheriff continued, his voice loud enough to echo off the canyon walls. "Says he did 4 years in the Leavenworth Penitentiary. Grand theft and assault. We don't want convicts living next to our town, Eleanor. We don't want jailbirds around our women." The yard went dead silent. The only sound was the wind rattling the dry cornstalks. Eleanor looked at Silas. Silas didn't look back at her. He looked down at the dirt. His shoulders slumped. The quiet dignity he carried while swinging a pickaxe vanished. He looked like a beaten dog. He had been framed for that theft by a crooked foreman, but the law didn't care about the truth of a poor man. They only cared about the ink on the paper. He knew how this ended. It always ended the same way. Silas reached down. He picked up his canvas jacket from the pile of stones. He dusted it off. "I'll pack my roll," Silas said. His voice was a dry rasp. "I'll be off your land in 10 minutes, ma'am." He turned to walk toward the line shack. To run. To disappear again. "Stop right there, Silas." Eleanor's voice cracked like a bullwhip. It froze Silas in his tracks. It made the sheriff's horse step back in surprise. Eleanor walked down the porch steps. She didn't look at Silas. She walked straight up to Sheriff Miller's horse. She looked up at the man with the star. Then she looked at Arthur Sterling. Her eyes were blazing. "You ran a background check on a man fixing my fence?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. "Eleanor, be reasonable," Sterling said, leaning forward. "He is a criminal. He is dangerous. You are a widow living alone. Society demands we intervene." Eleanor let out a sharp, humorless laugh. She turned her back on Sterling. She faced the whole group of men. She pointed a finger right at their chests. "You listen to me, and you listen well," Eleanor declared. Her voice rang with absolute, unshakable conviction. "No one has the right to use a past mistake, one that has already been paid for, to strip away an individual's right to work and their basic human rights in the present." The men blinked. They weren't used to being lectured by a woman, especially not about rights. Eleanor didn't stop. She took a step closer to the sheriff. "This society is built on tolerance and redemption, not blind prejudice. Silas Thorne served his time. The law of this country took 4 years of his life, and his debt to the state of Kansas is paid in full. To stand here and deny him the right to earn an honest living today, simply because of a paper from his past, is a violation of his dignity as a human being." Sterling's face darkened. "Eleanor, you are talking nonsense. A leopard doesn't change its spots." "And a banker doesn't change his greed," Eleanor snapped back, looking Sterling dead in the eye. "You judge a man by how he lives today, Arthur, not by a past sentence. Today, Silas Thorne worked 14 hours in the sun to rebuild what this fire destroyed. He has been respectful, honest, and hard-working. That is the measure of the man. The true value of human rights means we allow people the opportunity to rebuild their lives without a mob holding a noose of judgment over their heads." She turned away from Sterling. She looked at Silas. He was staring at her. His gray eyes were wide, his breath caught in his throat. In all his 45 years, through all the beatings, the chains, the whispers, and the closed doors, no one had ever stood up for him. No one had ever called him a human being deserving of rights. Eleanor looked back at the sheriff. "Silas Thorne works for me. He stays on my land. He eats at my table. If any of you step foot on this property to harass him again, you won't be dealing with a drifter. You'll be dealing with me and my shotgun. Now get off my land." Sheriff Miller looked at Sterling. Sterling's jaw was clenched so tight the muscle jumped in his cheek. But there was nothing they could do. It was her property. She had the law of ownership on her side. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor," Sterling hissed. When he robs you blind, don't come crying to my bank. I'd rather be robbed by an honest thief than slowly bled to death by a banker in a silk suit, Eleanor replied smoothly. Goodbye, Arthur. Sterling yanked his reins. His horse wheeled around. The sheriff and the ranchers followed. They rode out of the yard, leaving a thick cloud of dust behind them. Eleanor stood in the yard until the dust settled. Her hands were shaking. She shoved them deep into her apron pockets to hide it. She turned around. Silas was still standing by the stones. He had dropped his jacket. You don't have to pack your roll, Silas, she said softly. The fire had left her voice. She just sounded tired. Silas swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. They were right, ma'am, about Kansas. I did the time. I didn't ask you about Kansas. I asked you to fix my barn. Silas took a step toward her. The space between them felt charged, heavy. Why did you do that? You don't know me. Eleanor looked at him. She saw the scars. She saw the rough hands. But she also saw the man who had calmed her terrified horse. I know the man who swings the pickaxe, she said simply. That's the only man I care about. Get back to work, Silas. We're losing daylight. She turned and walked back to her porch. Silas stood there. His heart hammered against his ribs. Something broke inside him right then. The heavy iron shell he had worn around his soul for 10 years cracked wide open. He didn't just respect Eleanor Vance. He would die for her. He would tear the earth apart with his bare hands if she asked him to. He picked up his tools. The limestone rock suddenly didn't feel heavy at all. Midnight on the high plains. The world was a sea of black, lit only by a thin sliver of silver moon. The wind had died down. The ranch was silent, save for the distant, lonely howl of a coyote. Silas sat on the small wooden step of the line shack. A kerosene lantern burned low by his boots, casting long, jumping shadows. He had a bundle of green willow branches in his lap. His hands moved with practiced quiet speed, weaving over and under, pulling the strips tight. He was making a basket, a beautiful, sturdy basket. Tomorrow he would fill it with the wild blackberries he had found near the canyon edge. He heard the crunch of boots on gravel. Silas froze. His hand dropped to the heavy iron wrench beside him. A figure stepped out of the darkness into the edge of the lantern light. It was Eleanor. She was wearing a heavy wool shawl over her nightgown. She carried no lantern. She had walked through the dark, relying only on memory. Tucked under her arm was a long cylindrical leather tube. Silas quickly shoved the half-woven basket under the wooden step with his heel. He stood up. Ma'am, it's late. Is something wrong? Eleanor didn't speak right away. She looked at the small shack. She looked at the dark horizon toward the town of Red Rock. Then she looked at Silas. I couldn't sleep, she said. Her voice was a whisper. I kept thinking about Arthur Sterling. You put him in his place today. Arthur Sterling doesn't stay in his place, Silas. He regroups. She stepped closer to the light. Her face looked pale in the yellow glow, but her eyes were sharp, urgent. You asked me once why a wealthy banker cares so much about a burned-down ranch with bad soil. I figured he just wanted the acreage. Or... Silas trailed off. He didn't want to say, he wants you. Eleanor shook her head. Sterling doesn't care about cattle, and he certainly doesn't care about me. He cares about what's underneath us. She stepped onto the porch of the shack. She set the leather tube on the small, rough-hewn table by the door. She popped the cap off and slid out a thick roll of paper. Bring the lantern here, she ordered. Silas picked up the lamp. He held it over the table. Eleanor unrolled the paper. It was a map, but not an ordinary map. It was covered in intricate, hand-drawn lines, elevation markers, and geological symbols. It was detailed, professional. The ink was faded in places, but the numbers were sharp. What is this? Silas asked, leaning in. This, Eleanor said, tracing a finger over a large, blue-shaded area running directly beneath the center of her property, is the Ogallala Aquifer, or a deep offshoot of it. It's a massive underground river. Silas stared at the map. He looked at the lines. He knew how to read the earth. "How do you have this?" "I drew it," Eleanor said simply. "Before I married Thomas, I lived in San Antonio. My father was a surveyor. I spent my youth holding plumb bobs and reading geological surveys. For the last 3 years, while everyone in town thought the grieving widow was just knitting by the fire, I was out here, dropping lines, measuring soil sinkage, reading the limestone patterns." She looked up at Silas. The lantern light caught the fierce pride in her eyes. "There is water down there, Silas, pure, endless water. Enough to irrigate this entire valley. Enough to turn this dry dirt into an empire. Sterling knows. He secretly hired a surveyor from Austin a year ago. The surveyor drank too much at the saloon and let it slip to the bartender, who happens to be a friend of mine. That's why Sterling bought my husband's debts. That's why he's trying to choke me out. He wants the water." Silas ran a calloused finger over the paper. He tapped a cluster of topographical rings on the map. "It's deep," Silas said, his voice low. 80 feet, maybe 100, through hard pan and limestone. 86 feet, Eleanor corrected. "And yes, it's solid rock. That's why I haven't been able to do anything about it. My old hands, Josiah and Ezekiel, they can't dig a well that deep. They don't know how to shore up the walls. If I hire a crew from town, Sterling will find out instantly and call my loan before I hit water." She rolled the map back up. She turned to face him fully. "I need a man who knows how to move earth in the dark, a man who knows how to keep his mouth shut, a man who isn't afraid of the devil himself." She paused. "When I defended you today, you said I didn't know you. You're right. I don't know your past. But I know what you are capable of. Can you dig this well?" Silas looked at her, really looked at her. This woman was extraordinary. She was playing a dangerous, high-stakes game of chess against the most powerful man in the county, and she was doing it alone. She hadn't broken. She had planned. "Before Kansas," Silas said softly, the memories rising like dust. "I spent 5 years in the silver mines of Nevada. After that, I dug deep-bore wells in the New Mexico desert. I know how to cut timber shoring. I know how to blast rock without bringing the roof down. I can dig an 80-foot well with a pickaxe and a bucket." Eleanor let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for 3 years. Her shoulders dropped slightly. "We have to do it at night," she said. "If Sterling sees a drilling rig or fresh dirt, he'll know. We dig from midnight to 4 in the morning. We hide the dirt in the dry creek bed. We cover the hole with the ruined barn planks before the sun comes up." It was a crazy plan. It was back-breaking, dangerous work. Digging a deep well by lantern light, breathing stone dust, risking a cave-in. It's dangerous, Eleanor. If the shoring snaps, you get buried alive. "I am already buried alive, Silas," she whispered fiercely. "Sterling's debt is suffocating me. This water is my only way out. It is my independence." Silas didn't hesitate. He didn't think about the pain. He didn't think about the lack of sleep. He thought about the woman who had stood in front of a sheriff's gun and declared him a human being. "Where do we start?" Silas asked. A small, genuine smile broke across Eleanor's face. It was the first time Silas had seen her truly smile. It changed her entire face. It made his chest ache in a completely new way. "Behind the burned barn," she said. "The ground is softest there. I have shovels hidden in the cellar. I'll get my tools." Eleanor reached out. She touched his forearm. Her hand was warm against his cold sleeve. "Silas, thank you. I know I'm asking a lot." "You're paying me 20 cents a day, ma'am," Silas said, a rare hint of dry humor in his voice. "I aim to earn it." Eleanor nodded. She took her map, turned, and walked back toward the house, disappearing into the shadows. Silas watched her go. When she was out of sight, he knelt down. He reached under the wooden step. He pulled out the half-woven willow basket. He looked at it. Then he looked at his heavy iron wrench. He would weave the baskets at dusk. He would dig the well at midnight. He would work the ranch at dawn. He would not sleep. He would give her the water. He would give her the ranch. He would give her everything she needed to be free. He set the basket inside his shack. He grabbed his pickaxe. It was time to break the earth. 40 feet down. The air was cold. It tasted like copper and old dirt. There was no wind down in the hole, just the heavy, suffocating smell of wet clay and limestone. Silas swung the short-handled pickaxe. The iron bit into the rock. A sharp spark flashed in the dim lantern light. He twisted the handle. The rock cracked. He dropped to his knees. He scooped the loose rubble with his bare hands. He threw it into the heavy canvas bucket beside him. "Bucket!" he yelled. His voice bounced off the narrow dirt walls. A shadow moved across the sliver of starry sky 40 feet above. "Pulling!" Eleanor called back. The rope went taut. The heavy canvas bucket began a slow, twisting ascent. Dirt rained down on Silas's head and shoulders. He didn't blink. He just leaned back against the curved wall of the well, catching his breath. It had been 3 weeks. 3 weeks of double lives. By day, Silas fixed fences. He chopped wood. He played the part of the quiet, obedient drifter. By night, he was a mole, tearing into the earth, shoring up the sides of the shaft with cedar planks, risking a cave-in with every swing. If you enjoyed this journey, please support the channel with a like, leave your feelings in the comments, share the story, and subscribe for more heartfelt Western tales. Up top, Eleanor was doing the work of 2 men. She manned the winch. She hauled 80 pounds of dead earth out of the hole, hand over hand, hour after hour. She hauled it to the wagon. She drove it to the dry creek bed to hide the evidence before the sun came up. The bucket came back down, empty. "Come up, Silas," Eleanor called down. "It's past 2. We need a break." Silas grabbed the rope. He put his boots against the dirt wall and climbed hand over hand. His muscles screamed. He broke the surface and rolled onto the cool, damp grass. He lay flat on his back, staring up at the vast Texas sky. He was covered in mud from head to toe. Eleanor sat beside the winch. She was in just as bad a shape. Her face was streaked with dirt. Her knuckles were bleeding. She handed him a tin cup of water. Silas sat up. He took the cup. His fingers brushed hers. They were ice cold. "You're shivering," Silas said. "I'm fine. The wind picked up." Silas set the cup down. He took off his heavy canvas coat. It was dirty, but it was warm. He draped it around her shoulders. She didn't pull away. She pulled the collar tight against her neck. They sat in the dark. 2 exhausted people at the edge of a very deep hole. "You shouldn't be hauling that much weight," Silas said quietly, looking at her bleeding hands. "It's tearing your skin apart. Let me rig a block and tackle tomorrow. It'll halve the load." Eleanor looked down at her hands. She shook her head. "No, we don't have the time to build new rigging. And I don't want the work to be easy, Silas. I need to feel every inch of this well." She turned to look at him. The moonlight caught the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. "People in town look at me and see a widow who needs saving," she said, her voice steady and clear in the quiet night. "They think a woman's place is inside, waiting for a man to solve the hard problems. But true partnership isn't about a man protecting a fragile woman. It's about 2 capable people pulling the exact same weight, sharing the exact same dirt. Equality isn't a gift someone hands you. It's the right to bleed for this land exactly the way you do. I haul the dirt because my dignity is tied to this work, just as much as yours is." Silas listened. The absolute truth of her words settled deep in his chest. He had spent his life around men who viewed women as property or glass. Eleanor was neither. She was steel. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," Silas said. It wasn't a compliment. It was just a fact. Eleanor smiled, a small, tired smile. She leaned back on her hands. "I'm not always strong," she murmured. She looked out toward the dark horizon. The silence stretched between them. It was a comfortable silence, the kind earned through shared suffering. Then Eleanor sighed. "I found another basket this morning," she said softly. Silas went perfectly still. His heart skipped a beat. He kept his eyes fixed on the black mouth of the well. "Did you?" he asked. His voice was entirely flat. "Yes, a small jar of wild plum jam, and a carved wooden bird. A meadowlark, I think." Silas knew exactly what it was. He had spent 3 hours carving those delicate wings with a pocket knife by the creek. He had cut his thumb doing it. "It's strange," Eleanor continued, her voice taking on a thoughtful, almost vulnerable tone. "I hate Arthur Sterling. I hate what he stands for. I hate how he uses his money like a weapon." She pulled Silas's coat a little tighter around herself. "But I have to admit, Silas, those baskets keep me going. When I wake up and my body is broken from hauling dirt, and I feel like the whole world is trying to crush me, I walk out on the porch and there is a gift, something made with care, something quiet." Silas didn't speak. He couldn't. "It reminds me that humanity isn't entirely cruel," Eleanor said. "It proves that even a man like Arthur Sterling is capable of putting aside his greed to offer a simple, unconditional kindness. Even if he's doing it for the wrong reasons, the act itself gives me hope. It makes me feel less alone in this." It felt like a physical blow. A heavy, crushing weight pressed down on Silas's chest. The air suddenly felt too thin to breathe. She was finding hope. She was finding comfort. She was attributing the only pure, decent thing Silas had ever done in his life to the man who was trying to destroy her. He looked at her profile in the moonlight. She looked peaceful for the first time all day. "Tell her," a voice screamed in his head. "Tell her it's you. Tell her Sterling is a liar." But the words died in his throat. If he told her, he would have to explain why he was sneaking around in the dark. He would have to expose his own desperate, pathetic feelings for a woman far above his station. A woman he was supposed to just work for. An ex-convict drifting through town had no business courting a respectable ranch owner. More importantly, he would break the illusion. He would take away the twisted comfort she had found. He was just a drifter. He would be gone someday. The baskets would stop. Let her believe the town banker had a soul. It was safer for her. Silas stood up. He brushed the mud off his knees. His face was a mask of cold stone. "Break's over," he said roughly. "We have 20 more buckets to pull before sunrise." Eleanor looked up, surprised by the sudden edge in his voice. She handed him his coat back. "All right," she said. Silas put the coat on. He grabbed the rope. He didn't look at her as he stepped backward into the black hole. He slid down into the dark, letting the earth swallow him whole. It was exactly where he belonged, 80 feet. The air at the bottom of the well was heavy and damp. Water was seeping through the limestone walls. Not a river yet, but the rock was weeping. They were close, so close. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the conversation in the dark. Silas was up top, working in the harsh daylight. He was repairing the corral gate. Eleanor had taken the buckboard into Red Rock to buy flour and blasting powder. She wouldn't be back for hours. The yard was quiet. Then Silas heard the slow, deliberate crunch of boots on gravel. He didn't turn around immediately. He kept wrenching the bolt into the wood. But the hair on the back of his neck stood up. "You do good work, Thorne. Fast. Quiet." Silas stopped turning the wrench. He turned around. Arthur Sterling stood 10 feet away. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored coat. He was dressed in riding clothes, dusted with white earth. Sterling held his riding crop in his right hand. He was tapping it rhythmically against his leather boot. Tap, tap, tap. "I took a ride out by the old creek bed today," Sterling said smoothly. His voice was conversational, pleasant even. "Strange thing. The creek's been dry for 5 years, but suddenly there's a mountain of fresh, damp limestone piled up under the cottonwoods. Must be 20 tons of it." Silas didn't blink. He lowered the wrench to his side. "Must be," Sterling smiled. It was a vicious, victorious smile. "Limestone like that doesn't blow in on the wind. It comes from deep underground. It comes from someone digging a very deep, very illegal hole without a county permit." Sterling stepped closer. The pleasantness dropped from his voice. I know she's digging for the aquifer, Thorne. I know what she's trying to do, and I know you're the rat she hired to dig it." "It's her land," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "She doesn't need your permission to dig a hole. She needs a permit to tap the water table, which the bank, which I, must approve." Sterling pointed the riding crop at Silas's chest. "But that's not the real problem here. The problem is you." Sterling reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy yellow paper. He flicked it open. "I sent a man to Kansas, cost me a pretty penny. He dug up the actual court transcripts of your trial, Silas. Not just the charge, the details, the testimonies, and a very interesting piece of parole paper." Silas's blood ran cold. "You broke your parole by crossing state lines, didn't you, Silas? You are a fugitive from the Kansas authorities. The sheriff here doesn't know that yet. He just thought you were an ex-con. He didn't know you were actively running." Sterling folded the paper slowly. "If I hand this paper to Sheriff Miller, you go back to Leavenworth in chains. But that's not what I care about. What I care about is Eleanor." Sterling stepped right up to Silas. He lowered his voice to a venomous whisper. "When the sheriff finds out Eleanor Vance has been secretly harboring a wanted fugitive, hiding him on her property, employing him, she will be arrested as an accomplice. The bank will seize this ranch before the sun sets. She will lose her land, her freedom, and her good name. The town will ruin her." Silas gripped the iron wrench so tight his knuckles turned white. His muscles coiled. He could swing the iron. He could crush Sterling's skull right here in the dirt. It would take 1 second. But Sterling saw it in his eyes and laughed. "Go ahead. Kill me. Then she's an accomplice to murder. Either way, she loses everything." Silas forced his breathing to slow. He forced his hand to open, dropping the wrench into the dirt. "What do you want?" Silas rasped. "I want you gone," Sterling said simply. "I want you to pack your bindle and ride off this property tonight. You vanish. You never speak to her again. If you are gone by sunrise, I burn this Kansas paper. I'll deal with Eleanor and the well my own way. But if I see your face in this county tomorrow morning, I will drag her reputation through the mud, and I will take everything she owns." Silas stood perfectly still. The Texas sun beat down on his shoulders, but he felt nothing but ice. He looked at Sterling. He looked at the arrogance, the absolute certainty of power in the man's eyes. "You think this is how you win," Silas said. His voice wasn't angry. It was heavy with pity. "You think her reputation is just a bargaining chip. You think a woman's worth is tied to the men she associates with or the money she owes. You're wrong, Sterling. Her dignity belongs to her alone. She built this place with her own hands. She hauled the dirt. She bled for it. Real power is building something together as equals. All you know how to do is tear people down." Sterling sneered. "Save the sermons for the church. You're a convict. She's a desperate woman. Equality is a myth for the poor. You have until midnight." Sterling turned. He walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode away. Silas stood in the empty yard. The wind blew dust across his boots. He looked at the house. He looked at the hidden planks covering the well. He thought about the water, just a few feet away from breaking through the rock. He thought about Eleanor driving the buckboard right now, fighting for her independence. If he stayed, she would hit water. But Sterling would destroy her with the law. She would lose the ranch. If he left, she would be safe from the law. She would have to fight Sterling on her own. It wasn't a choice at all. Midnight. The line shack was dark. Silas didn't light the lantern. He moved by feel. He rolled his thin wool blanket. He packed his spare shirt. It took less than 2 minutes. A man with nothing leaves quickly. He knelt on the floorboards. He pried up a loose plank near the corner. Underneath was a small, hollow space. Inside the space was his wooden box. He opened it. Inside were half-finished willow branches, a spool of green thread, a small carving knife, and a wooden doll, half-whittled, meant for the next basket. Silas reached into his pocket. He pulled out a heavy leather pouch. It held every coin he had saved from the silver mines, every dollar he had earned in 5 years of drifting, $200 in gold and silver. He placed the pouch in the box. Beside the pouch, he laid a piece of paper. He had gone to the assayer's office in secret 2 weeks ago. It was a deed of proxy. It gave Eleanor Vance the legal right to claim all his assets. It was enough money to pay off Arthur Sterling, in full. Silas looked at the half-woven basket. He touched the smooth willow wood one last time. She never knew, he thought. And she never will. It was better this way. She would think Sterling stopped sending the baskets. She would have the money to save the ranch. She would be free. He closed the box. He put the floorboard back in place. Silas stood up. He threw his bedroll over his shoulder. He walked out of the line shack. He didn't look at the house. He didn't look at the porch where he had left a piece of his heart every morning for a month. He turned his face to the dark, open plains. He started walking. He was gone. Dawn broke over the high plains. It wasn't a gentle sunrise. It was a cold, sharp line of gray that cut the sky in half. Eleanor woke with a start. Her back ached. Her shoulders were stiff from hauling dirt. She sat up in the dark bedroom. She listened. The house was quiet. Too quiet. She pulled on her heavy wool sweater. She tied her boots in the dark. It was a routine. Wake up, dress, walk to the kitchen, put the coffee on, open the front door. She walked down the hallway. Her boots tapped a dull rhythm on the floorboards. She reached the front door. She turned the brass knob. She pushed the heavy wood open. The cold morning air hit her face. She looked down. Nothing. The top step was empty. Just bare, weathered wood. Eleanor stared at the spot. She blinked. She expected the basket to somehow materialize if she just looked hard enough. It didn't. There was no woven willow, no warm bread, no wild plums, no flowers, just an empty step. A sudden, sharp chill ran down her spine. It had nothing to do with the wind. She stepped out onto the porch. She looked toward the road. Empty. She looked toward the corral. Copper was standing by the fence, his breath pluming in the cold air. But the yard was still. "Silas," she whispered. She didn't know why his name came to her lips first, but it did. She stepped off the porch. She started walking, fast. She crossed the hard-packed dirt of the yard. She headed straight for the line shack near the creek. The door to the shack was slightly ajar. It was swinging just an inch back and forth in the wind. A slow, mournful creak. Eleanor pushed the door open. The small room was empty. The iron stove was dead cold. The small wooden table was bare. She looked at the corner. The thin mattress was still there. But the gray wool bedroll was gone. His canvas coat was gone. The heavy leather boots that usually sat by the door were gone. He had packed. He had left. Eleanor stood in the center of the room. Her breath came shallow and fast. Why? They were so close. The well was almost finished. They were going to hit water in a matter of days. Why would he just vanish in the dark? She spun around. She looked for a note, a sign, anything. There was nothing on the table, nothing on the windowsill. She took a step toward the bed. Her boot caught the edge of a floorboard. It didn't sound solid. It made a hollow, rattling sound. Eleanor looked down. One plank was loose. It sat slightly uneven with the rest. She knelt. Her hands were shaking. She wedged her fingers into the crack. She pulled. The rough pine board popped up easily. Underneath was a dark, square hollow in the dirt. Inside the hollow sat a wooden box. Eleanor reached down. She pulled the box up. It was heavy. The wood was plain, but the joints were cut with perfect, careful precision. She set it on the floor. She flipped the brass latch. She opened the lid. The smell hit her first. Green wood, fresh sap. She stared into the box. Her heart stopped. The world seemed to stop spinning. Lying inside were dozens of thin green willow branches. They were stripped clean, soaked and pliable. Next to them was a thick spool of heavy green thread. The exact same thread used to bind the handles of the baskets that had sat on her porch for a month. Resting on top of the willow branches was a wooden doll. It was half-carved. The face wasn't finished. what the wings were. The delicate, tiny wings of a meadowlark. Eleanor reached out. Her fingers trembled. She picked up the wooden bird. She looked at the knife marks. She remembered the meadowlark she had found in the basket yesterday. She remembered Silas's calloused, scarred hands. She remembered the way he had calmed the wild horse with a gentle touch. The realization hit her. It didn't come slowly. It hit her like a runaway train. Arthur Sterling never sent a single basket. Arthur Sterling didn't pick wildflowers in the dark. Arthur Sterling didn't bake bread. It was Silas. Every single morning, every piece of carved wood, every jar of honey, it was the quiet, scarred drifter who lived in this freezing shack. Eleanor dropped the wooden bird. She covered her mouth with both hands. A sob tore its way up her throat. She remembered the day Sterling had visited. She remembered Sterling standing on her porch claiming the gifts were his, calling it a courtship. And she remembered Silas. Silas had been standing down by the corral. He had heard everything. He had heard her say she hated Sterling, but that the baskets gave her hope. He had let the rich man take the credit. He had stayed in the shadows. He had kept making the baskets, night after night, bleeding his own hands just so she could wake up and feel a little less alone. He gave her everything. He took nothing. "You fool," she whispered, tears finally breaking free and tracking through the dust on her face. "You beautiful, stubborn fool." She looked back into the box. Under the willow branches was a heavy leather pouch and a folded piece of thick paper with an official county seal. Eleanor picked up the paper. She unfolded it. It was an assayer's deed of proxy. She read the neat, official handwriting. It gave her full, unconditional claim to the assets in the pouch. It was signed at the bottom, a rough, jagged signature, Silas Thorne. She opened the pouch. Gold eagles, silver dollars. It was heavy. It was a fortune. $200. It was the price of a man's life in the mines. It was everything he had in the world. It was the exact amount she owed Arthur Sterling. Eleanor slumped back against the wall of the shack. She clutched the money and the paper to her chest. She couldn't breathe. The weight of his sacrifice was too heavy. He hadn't run away. He had been driven away. Sterling must have found out about the well. Sterling must have threatened him. And Silas, the man who had been chained and beaten by the world, had traded his only escape money and his presence to buy her freedom. He vanished so she could survive. She had paid him 20 cents a day. He had given her his entire life. And she never knew. She never looked past the quiet facade. She never asked him what his hands were doing in the dark. She just took the baskets, thanked a ghost, and let him walk away. She never knew until he was gone. Eleanor sat on the floor of the empty shack for a long time. She let the tears fall. She let the regret wash over her. She let the pain of his absence hollow her out. But Eleanor Vance was not a woman who stayed hollow for long. When the sun finally cleared the horizon, flooding the shack with hard, unforgiving light, she stopped crying. She looked at the proxy deed. She looked at the gold. A new feeling began to replace the grief. It was small at first, a spark, then a flame, then a roaring white-hot fire. Anger, fierce, unyielding anger. Sterling had manipulated her. He had threatened Silas. He had forced a good man into the wilderness to steal a ranch he had no right to. Eleanor stood up. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve. She put the pouch of gold and the proxy deed into her apron pockets. She looked at the unfinished wooden bird on the floor. She picked it up. She slid it into her pocket, right next to the gold. She walked out of the lion shack. Her stride was long. Her boots hit the dirt hard. She wasn't going to cry anymore. She was going to Red Rock. And she was going to tear Arthur Sterling's world apart. The ride into Red Rock was a blur of dust and pounding hooves. Eleanor rode Copper. The young roan gelding ran hard. Silas had trained him well. He didn't spook. He just ate up the miles, his coat lathered in white sweat by the time they hit the town limits. Main Street was busy, wagons rolling, cowboys loitering, men tipping their hats. Eleanor didn't look at any of them. She rode straight to the First National Bank of Red Rock. It was the only brick building in town, imposing, cold. built to make people feel small. She didn't tie Copper to the rail. She just dropped the reins, trusting the horse to stay. She marched up the wooden steps. She kicked the heavy glass door open. It slammed against the inside wall with a crack that made everyone in the lobby jump. 3 clerks behind the brass grills stopped counting money. They stared at her. Eleanor was covered in trail dust. She wore men's trousers, a heavy sweater, and a look that could cut glass. "Where is he?" Eleanor demanded. A young clerk swallowed hard. He pointed a trembling finger toward the heavy oak door at the back. Eleanor didn't wait. She marched across the marble floor. She didn't knock. She grabbed the brass handle, twisted, and shoved the door wide open. Arthur Sterling was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk. He had a ledger open. He held a silver fountain pen. He looked up, startled. When he saw it was Eleanor, his surprise melted into a smug, oily smile. He leaned back in his leather chair. He steepled his fingers. "Eleanor," he said smoothly, "I didn't expect you until the end of the month. I heard your hired help ran off in the night. Tragic. Are you here to surrender the deed?" Eleanor didn't say a word. She walked straight up to the desk. She reached into her heavy pockets. She pulled out the leather pouch. She didn't place it on the desk. She slammed it down. The heavy impact made the inkwell jump. The clink of solid gold echoed in the quiet room. Sterling's smile vanished. He stared at the pouch. "What is this?" he asked. "Your buyout," Eleanor said. Her voice was ice. Cold. Deadly. $200, in gold and silver. Count it. Then hand me the lien on my property." Sterling looked from the gold to Eleanor. His face flushed red. He sat forward, his hands flat on the desk. "Where did you get this kind of money?" he demanded. His voice was losing its smooth edge. "You can't pay this. That money is stolen. Your drifter robbed someone, didn't he? I'll have Sheriff Miller arrest you both." Eleanor pulled the Assier's proxy deed from her pocket. She slapped it down on top of the gold. "It's clean money, Arthur, earned in the silver mines, legally transferred to me by proxy, signed, sealed, and witnessed by the county assayer. It pays off my husband's debt in full. You have no legal claim to my land. You have no claim to the water underneath it. You are out." Sterling stared at the paper. He read the seal. He knew it was ironclad. He was beaten. He stood up. He slammed his fist on the desk. The polished banker facade cracked completely, revealing the ugly, desperate man underneath. "You stupid woman," Sterling spat. "You think you've won? You're a widow holding a piece of dirt. That drifter left you because you're nothing. You need me. You need the bank to build that well. You can't survive out there alone. Women like you break. You always break. You should have just taken the baskets and played the game." Eleanor didn't flinch. She stood her ground. She looked at the red-faced, screaming man. She felt nothing but profound pity. She leaned forward. She planted both hands on his mahogany desk. She looked him dead in the eye. When she spoke, her voice filled the room. It was steady. It was absolute. "Did you really think we were such fragile creatures, Arthur?" she said. Every word struck like a hammer. "Did you look at me and see a weak thing, easily bought by a few hollow gifts and the manipulation of power? You thought you could arrange my life. You thought you could arrange who I employed, who I loved, and what I owned." Sterling opened his mouth to speak, but Eleanor cut him off, her voice rising with fierce authority. "Equality doesn't allow me to bow to you. You hear me? The right of a woman to stand on her own 2 feet is not something you can foreclose on. You thought money gave you the right to strip away Silas Thorne's dignity and force him into the dark, but you were wrong. You have all the money in this town, Arthur, but you will forever be bankrupt of compassion. You will never know what it means to build something with your own 2 hands. You will never know what it means to be truly loved, because you only know how to buy people." She stood up straight. She tapped the proxy deed. "Now, sign the release, before I go get the sheriff and tell him exactly how you've been using his office to harass citizens on private property." Sterling glared at her. His chest heaved. He hated her. He hated her strength. But he was a banker first. The money was on the table. The law was on her side. He snatched his silver pen. He scribbled his signature across the release of lien. He threw the document across the desk. "Get out," he hissed. "Get out of my bank." Eleanor took the paper. She folded it neatly. She put it in her pocket. "It's Mrs. Vance to you," she said. She turned her back on him. She walked out of the office. She didn't look back. She walked through the lobby. The clerks parted for her like the Red Sea. She pushed out through the glass doors. The sunlight hit her face. She stood on the wooden boardwalk. She took a deep breath. The air tasted different. It tasted clean. She was free. The ranch was hers. The water was hers. The debt was gone. But the victory felt hollow. The chest where her heart used to be just felt empty. She had the ranch, but she didn't have the man who helped her save it. Eleanor walked down the street to the sheriff's office. She didn't go in. She found Josiah and Ezekiel loading supplies outside the general store. "Josiah," Eleanor called out. The old ranch hand looked up. "Morning, ma'am. We got the flour." "Take the wagon back to the ranch," Eleanor said. Her voice was brisk, all business. "You and Zeke are in charge. The lien is paid. The bank won't bother us anymore. Finish shoring up the well. I'll be back when I'm back." Josiah blinked. He looked at her horse. Copper was still breathing hard. "Where are you going, Mrs. Vance?" Eleanor reached into her pocket. Her fingers closed around the half-finished wooden meadowlark. The wood was smooth, carved by scarred, gentle hands. She looked out toward the west. The trail led out of town, stretching into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Texas plains. A man on foot couldn't have gotten far in half a day. Not a man carrying a heavy bedroll. She pulled herself up into Copper's saddle. She gathered the reins. "I'm going to find my ranch hand," Eleanor said. "We have a well to finish." She clicked her tongue. Copper leaped forward. Eleanor Vance rode out of Red Rock. She didn't ride like a widow. She rode like a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and exactly what she was worth. She was going to find the man who left the baskets, and she was going to bring him home. The trail west was hard. It was a ribbon of cracked clay cutting through a sea of dry yellow grass. Eleanor rode Copper hard. She didn't stop for the heat of the afternoon. She didn't stop when the sun dipped low, turning the Texas sky into a bruised canvas of purple and blood red. She just rode. She knew where he was heading. There was only one way out of the county for a man on foot. The junction station at Bitter Creek. It was 50 miles away. A watering stop for the heavy iron trains pushing toward the New Mexico territory. She rode into the night. The moon was a pale sliver. Coyotes howled in the deep canyons. Eleanor kept her hand on the reins and her eyes on the horizon. Her muscles screamed. Her throat was coated in fine, gritty dust. She didn't care. She had the proxy deed in her pocket. She had the unfinished wooden meadowlark, and she had a fury in her chest that burned hotter than the midday sun. It was mid-morning of the second day when she finally saw it, a thick plume of black coal smoke staining the blue sky. Bitter Creek. It wasn't a town, just a wooden platform, a water tower, and a telegraph office built beside 2 lines of steel track. A massive steam locomotive sat idling at the platform. The engine hissed. Steam billowed from the iron valves, wrapping the wooden platform in a thick gray fog. The smell of burning coal and hot grease filled the air. People milled about. Drifters, cattlemen, men looking for the next strike, men running from the last one. Eleanor pulled Copper back. She slid down from the saddle. Her legs nearly gave out. She grabbed the saddle horn, steadied herself, and tied the exhausted horse to the hitching post. She walked toward the platform. The heavy wooden boards groaned under her boots. She scanned the crowd. Her eyes darted over the worn hats and canvas coats. The conductor blew a sharp, shrill whistle. "All aboard! Westbound to Santa Fe! All aboard!" Men started pushing toward the iron stairs of the passenger cars. And then she saw him. He was standing near the back of the line. He held a canvas bedroll over one broad shoulder. His hat was pulled low. He looked completely defeated. A ghost of a man waiting to be swallowed by a steel machine. He took a step toward the stairs. "Silas!" Her voice cut through the hiss of the steam and the chatter of the crowd. It was ragged, broken by dust, but it carried. Silas froze. He didn't turn around. His shoulders went rigid. Eleanor didn't wait. She shoved past a man in a bowler hat. She elbowed a rancher out of the way. She marched straight up behind Silas, reached out and grabbed the heavy fabric of his coat. She spun him around. Silas stared at her. His gray eyes were wide, shocked. The color drained from his weathered face. "Eleanor," he breathed. "What are you doing here?" "I'm returning something," Eleanor said. She reached into her deep apron pocket. She pulled out the unfinished willow basket. The green thread was still dangling from the rim. She didn't hand it to him gently. She shoved it hard into his chest. Silas staggered back half a step. He caught the basket on reflex. He looked down at the woven willow. Then he looked up at her. He couldn't speak. "You left it under the floorboards," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with rage and exhaustion. "Right next to the money you used to pay off my ranch." Silas swallowed hard. He looked around. The crowd was moving past them. The train was belching thick smoke. "You shouldn't have come," Silas said, his voice a low, painful rasp. "Sterling knows about Kansas. He has the parole papers. If he sees me anywhere near you, he'll take the ranch. He'll ruin you. I had to leave. I had to make you safe." Eleanor stepped closer. She tilted her head up, looking right into his eyes. "Arthur Sterling isn't going to ruin anyone. I paid the lien. I took your gold, I slammed it on his mahogany desk, and I bought my land back. The proxy deed is filed. He has no claim. He has no power." Silas blinked. He processed the words. The debt was gone. But the fear in his chest didn't leave. "He still has the papers, Eleanor. He can send the sheriff after me. I'm a fugitive. I'm dangerous to you. You're a respectable woman. You have the ranch now. You can hit the water. You can be free. Just let me get on this train." He tried to turn away. Eleanor reached out and grabbed his arm. Her grip was iron. "Don't you dare walk away from me, Silas Thorne," she commanded. He stopped. He looked back at her. His eyes were shining with unshed tears. The pain of a man trying to cut out his own heart for the sake of another. "I'm trying to protect you," Silas whispered. "I don't want your protection," Eleanor shouted. The anger finally broke open, spilling out in the crowded, noisy station. She let go of his arm. She took a step back. She pointed a finger right at his chest. "You listen to me, Silas," she said. Her voice was loud, clear, ringing over the hiss of the steam engine. People on the platform turned to look. She didn't care. "Did you actually think silent sacrifice was noble? Did you think sneaking away in the dark made you a hero?" Silas flinched. "Love is not a charity," Eleanor declared, her words vibrating with absolute certainty. "Love is not making decisions for someone else because you think you know what is best for them. As a free and independent woman, I have the fundamental right to choose exactly who I love and exactly who stands beside me on my own land." Silas stood frozen. The unfinished basket hung from his hand. Eleanor took a step closer, her voice lowering just a fraction, but losing none of its fierce power. "You thought you were giving me freedom by leaving. But true equality means we face the danger together. I don't need a man to step back into the shadows to protect my fragile reputation. I am not fragile. I need a partner brave enough to stand beside me as an equal against the storm. If Arthur Sterling brings the law, we fight the law together. If the well caves in, we dig it out together. That is what human dignity looks like." The conductor blew the final whistle. "All aboard! Doors closing!" Silas looked at the train. He looked at the iron wheels. He looked at the dark, empty future waiting for him in the west. Then he looked at Eleanor. She was covered in dust. Her hair was wild. Her eyes were red from the wind and lack of sleep. She was the most beautiful, terrifying, magnificent thing he had ever seen in his entire life. She reached into her pocket one last time. She pulled out the small, unfinished wooden meadowlark. "You started this," she said softly. "You owe me the rest of the wings." Silas stared at the wooden bird. The heavy, suffocating weight he had carried for 10 years, the shame of his past, the belief that he was unworthy of love, the conviction that a drifter had no place beside a queen, finally shattered. It broke into a million pieces and scattered in the Texas wind. Silas dropped his canvas bedroll onto the wooden planks. The heavy thud was swallowed by the roar of the steam engine. He reached out. He took the wooden bird from her fingers. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He just wrapped his arms around her. He pulled her against his chest. He buried his face in her dusty hair. Eleanor closed her eyes. She wrapped her arms around his back. She felt the heavy, steady rhythm of his heart against hers. The great iron train lurched forward. The wheels screamed against the steel tracks. The whistle blew a long, mournful cry as the locomotive pulled away from the platform, heading west. Silas didn't look at it. He held on to Eleanor like a man holding onto the very edge of the world. "I'll finish the wings," Silas whispered against her hair. "I'll finish the well. I'll fight the sheriff. I'll fight Sterling. I'll fight the whole damn state of Texas if you ask me to." Eleanor smiled against his coat. The smell of cedar and lye soap filled her senses. "I'm not asking you to fight the world, Silas. I'm just asking you to come home." Silas pulled back. He looked at her face. He reached up and wiped a streak of dirt from her cheek with a scarred thumb. "Okay," he said. He picked up his bedroll. He picked up the unfinished basket. They walked off the platform together. Two equals stepping out of the smoke and into the clear, bright light of the morning. 2 years later. Spring, 1880. The water was a miracle. It didn't just flow, it rushed. It poured from the deep iron pipe Silas had set into the bedrock, spilling into a massive wooden trough before channeling out into the irrigation ditches. The Vance Thorne Ranch wasn't brown anymore. It was a sea of vibrant, impossible green. The wheat grew tall and thick. The horses were fat. The broken fences were rebuilt, strong and straight. Arthur Sterling was gone. He had overextended his bank on bad railroad bonds 6 months after Eleanor paid her debt. The bank failed. Sterling left Red Rock in the middle of the night, chased by his own angry creditors. The law never came for Silas. A new sheriff was elected, a man who cared more about rustlers than decade-old parole violations from Kansas. The sun was just beginning to break over the eastern ridge. Eleanor woke up. The bed was warm, but the space beside her was empty. She smiled. She pulled on her thick robe. She didn't hurry. The frantic, desperate edge to her mornings was gone. The crushing weight of the debt was a memory. She walked down the hallway. She didn't open the front door. She walked into the kitchen. The iron stove was already crackling. The smell of burning mesquite wood and roasting coffee beans filled the small room. Silas stood by the counter. He was older now. The gray at his temples had spread. The scars on his face were still there, but the haunted look in his eyes was entirely gone. He wore a clean blue shirt. He heard her footsteps. He turned around. He didn't have a woven basket in his hands. Instead, he held 2 heavy ceramic mugs. Steam curled off the top of the black coffee. He walked over to the wooden table. He set one mug down in front of her chair. "Morning," Silas said. His voice was still rough, but it held a warmth that used to belong only to the horses. "Morning," Eleanor replied. She sat down. She wrapped her hands around the hot mug. She looked out the kitchen window. She could see the massive water pump in the distance, catching the first rays of the morning sun. She could see Josiah and Ezekiel leading the draft horses out to the green fields. She looked back at Silas. He sat across from her, blowing on his coffee. There were no more baskets on the porch. They didn't need them anymore. A basket was a silent thing, a gift left in the dark by a man too afraid to show his face, for a woman too proud to ask for help. They didn't live in the dark anymore. "Pump pressure looks good," Silas said, nodding toward the window. "We'll run the water to the South 40 today. Ought to be enough to soak the new alfalfa." "I'll help you change the gate valves after breakfast," Eleanor said. "The rust on the main hinge is getting bad. We need to grease it." "I can do it." "We can do it together," Eleanor corrected gently. Silas looked at her. He smiled. That deep, genuine smile that still made her heart do a slow roll in her chest. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Eleanor took a sip of her coffee. It was strong. Perfect. She looked at her husband. She looked at his scarred hands resting on the table. She reached across the wood and covered his hand with hers. Her hands were still calloused, still rough, the hands of a woman who worked the earth. Silas turned his hand over. He intertwined his fingers with hers, a silent, steady grip. Love wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a wealthy banker offering to buy away a woman's pain. It wasn't even a beautifully woven willow basket left on a cold porch in the dead of night. Love was waking up every single morning, looking across a table at your equal, and choosing to build the world together. Hand in hand, in the light. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.
In the end, the story of Eleanor Vance and Silas Thorne is not only a tale of the Old West, of burned barns, hidden water, cruel bankers, and lonely trails. It is a story about human worth. It reminds us that a person's value is not measured by money, reputation, past mistakes, or the judgment of society, but by the honesty of their heart and the kindness of their actions. Eleanor was a widow in a world that expected her to surrender, but she refused to let hardship steal her dignity. Silas was a broken man carrying the weight of his past, yet he still chose compassion, sacrifice, and silent love. Together, they show us that true strength is not always loud. Sometimes strength is a woman standing alone against injustice. Sometimes it is a man leaving a basket on a porch before dawn, asking for nothing in return. The meaning of this story lies in the power of compassion and second chances. Too often, people are judged by where they have been, instead of who they are trying to become. Silas had been cast aside by the world, but Eleanor saw his labor, his gentleness, and his humanity. She gave him respect when others gave him suspicion, and in return, Silas gave her loyalty deeper than words. This teaches us that kindness can restore what cruelty has broken. A fair hand extended at the right moment can give someone the courage to believe they are still worthy of love, trust, and a future. This story also reminds us that love is not always found in grand speeches or proud declarations. Real love often lives in small, quiet acts. A warm loaf of bread, a carved wooden bird, a coat placed over cold shoulders, a sacrifice made in silence, so another person can be free. Silas loved Eleanor not by trying to own her, but by helping her stand stronger on her own feet. And Eleanor's love, when she finally understood the truth, was not born from weakness or dependence, but from respect, gratitude, and recognition of the soul behind the scars. Above all, this tale tells us that dignity must never be bought, sold, or taken away. Greed may wear fine clothes, and cruelty may hide behind power, but neither can defeat a heart that knows its own worth. Eleanor fought for her land, but more than that, she fought for her right to live as an equal human being. Silas fought for her freedom, but he also found his own redemption along the way. Their journey leaves us with one lasting message. Never underestimate the wounded, the quiet, the poor, or the forgotten. Sometimes they carry the deepest love, the strongest courage, and the greatest truth. So as this story closes, may we remember to look beyond appearances, to offer fairness where others offer judgment, and to recognize the silent sacrifices made by those who love without asking to be seen. Because in the harshest deserts of life, It is compassion that becomes water, dignity that becomes shelter, and love that finally leads us home.